Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 112 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today's episode is a bonus episode. Last year, I appeared as a guest on the Mark of the Maker podcast with Mark, Tom, and Sean. Mark of the Maker is a podcast about knives, knife makers, and knife collecting. We talked about my book, Covert Arms, Weapons from the World of Spycraft and Espionage, which had just been published at the time. I thought that this would be a great episode to share with my own listeners, as we discuss a lot of unique and mostly unknown weapons from World War II, the Cold War, and beyond. Mark, Tom, and Sean are all very knowledgeable guys, and we had a great discussion that ended up running for nearly 2 hours and covered a lot of fascinating topics. If you aren't already familiar with their podcast, then after this, you should definitely check it out. I know some of you already have, because a lot of my own followers and listeners have mentioned it more than once to me. You can also find them on Instagram under the name @MarkOfTheMaker. Without further ado, here is that episode.
Hey everybody, I'm Mark Stheiner and you're listening to Mark of the Maker. This is episode 89 of the show, and we have a very interesting guest with us. We think you'll really enjoy it. Someone we've talked about before. I'm not going to dive into that just yet. Let's make sure we have our folks here. We're one man down this week, so we have Mr. Tom Krein.
Hey guys.
And we have Mr. Sean Kendrick.
Hey.
All right, and so we're missing Michael Birch this time. Michael, I believe, is partaking in some fine orchestral music tonight, as I recall.
I'm guessing it's John Philip Sousa or something like that, getting slaughtered.
John Philip Sousa not being honored properly? Is that what you're suggesting, Tom?
It seems like every single band in every single school plays that.
Yeah.
Some John Philip Sousa songs.
You ain't had kids in school lately, man. Everything's Disney.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Well, Michael's at a middle school band concert, so as you might guess, he might actually wish he was here at least once his son gets done playing, but anyway, that's why he's not with us tonight. We do want to start out by thanking our patrons, our friends on Patreon. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, you can go to patreon.com, patreon.com. And that's a website where people can pledge money to support creative stuff that they like. And in our case, that's the podcast. So if you go to patreon.com and type in Mark of the Maker, you can find us there. If we are well supported by folks who send us a couple bucks a month to help support the show and keep the wheels greased and things in motion. We ship microphones around the country and do all kinds of crazy stuff. Sometimes equipment needs replaced or updated or whatever, and so that's what that Patreon money does. So high five to everyone who helps us out and lends a hand through Patreon.
Thanks, folks.
Appreciate you guys.
I think Sean has an encrypted message for our audience.
Get out your decoder rings, and if you can figure out the secret message, you'll get 75% off from American Metal Exchange.
Is that authorized?
This is not binding in any way, shape, form, or fashion.
Oh, no. Yeah, do not give the code.
It's in there. You just got to have the decoder ring. Trust me.
I gotcha. Okay, that's why your voice sounded scrambled at the beginning. I got it. It's very clever.
Indeed. Works on many levels. And since our topic is espionage tonight, and secrets are the stock and trade of espionage, you know what's not a secret? The quality pricing and customer service at American Metal Exchange. For any of the exotic materials you could possibly need, hit up George at American Metal Exchange, and he'll get you squared away in no time at all. So head on over to amxinc.com and tell them Sean sent you. That's amxinc.com. amxinc.com.
Dang. Justin, you might need this kind of talent on your show.
I know. I've been flying solo. Well, I can see that's a mistake.
Yeah, he's got a golden voice for ads.
Yep.
Too funny. Thanks, George, for your help and your support. We really appreciate you. I get it now. I finally figured out why Sean always says, tell him Sean sent you. Sean's out there getting that discount that he mentioned. I'm quite confident about it. All right.
Dude, it's all about the kickbacks.
You got to take them where you can get them. All right. So our guest this week, we've alluded to it and heard him chime in here. Our guest this week is a gentleman named Justin Black. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this.
And Justin runs an Instagram account named Spycraft 101, and we've talked about it numerous times on the show. It's a favorite of ours. So I guess, Justin, we'll describe you as a Spycraft content guy, author, I don't know, all kinds of stuff. Maybe not all kinds of stuff. We're not going to talk about Justin. He's cloaked in secrecy. He's a man of mystery.
I appreciate that. If you had some of the interactions with my own followers that I've had, you'd understand why I don't want people to know where I live or who I am or anything like that. Believe me, there's a lot of weirdos out there. They all seem to gravitate to me.
Yeah. Well, that comes with the territory.
It does. It definitely does. I can take it.
You talk sneaky stuff and weird things, and you're going to get sneaky people and weird people, no doubt.
Yeah, certainly.
All right. So Justin's written a couple of really cool books. I have both of them here with me. The first one was called Spy Shots Volume 1, 101 True Tales from the World of Espionage, which is a really, really cool book. And a new one. How long ago did you come out with this Covert Arms book, Justin?
That was last month, I think.
Okay.
Maybe 6 weeks ago now.
Okay. So it's called Covert Arms, Weapons from the World of Spycraft and Espionage. Justin likes the long titles. I like that too. You got to have a wordy title.
Yeah, a little repetition there for you.
We had this book that we referenced on the show a couple times that one of our guests, Dr. Rachel Parikh, who's an arms and armor expert, has joined us a couple of episodes. And Rachel recommended this book by a guy named George Cameron Stone. And it's literally like a paragraph long, the title of the book. But it's a fantastic reference for historic arms and armor over the years. So we always joke about that craziness. So yeah, the books are really, really cool. Okay, so we've talked about the Spycraft account on the show a bunch of times. It's fascinating to read. Clearly you're doing tons of research to put this out at the frequency that you do. I can only imagine the time that it takes. Your wife might not be a fan, but
Yep. Well, she's happy to not see me for a couple of hours every day, I guess. She edited that out, actually. Right. Yep.
So how did you even get into doing this? How did you get into this topic? Is it just something you found fascinating, or?
Yeah, it was. It was about 15 years ago now, roughly, and it just started with me picking up a book. The book I still remember was called The Killer Elite by Michael Smith, and it's still available, and I have it on my my must-read book lists and all that. And I think I just bought it because I liked the cover. I didn't think too much about it. I was reading other combat biographies and that sort of thing at the time. And the book is about an Army Special Missions unit called the Activity. It's actually had several different names over the years, but that was the one that it's most commonly known by. And it was formed in the late 1970s, and it did a lot of really interesting stuff in the 80s and 90s, and probably still around under some other name right now. And it really just opened my eyes to a world that I was not hardly aware of. And, every chapter was this mind-blowing story. Things that I know now that maybe are more common knowledge, but it blew my mind at the time, like, U.S. personnel going back into Vietnam in the mid-1980s looking for POWs, right, which is now something that I've covered. But at the time, I was like, are you kidding me? I had no idea that was going on. I thought that was, a plot of a Rambo movie or a Gene Hackman movie only.
Right.
So it all happened, though, of course. So that really got me started reading, researching, that sort of thing, without a whole lot of purpose, just out of a hobby kind of interest, And over the years, it kind of morphed into, my interest in history. Like, my degrees are in history, and I had this military and government experience, so it kind of grew and developed, and I finally decided to start putting pen to paper a little bit, or, pen to Instagram, I guess I could say. And start sharing some of these stories that I'd come up with, because I knew they were interesting. They were a little bit hard to track down. And so I wanted to share them where the people are, which is social media now, in a way that they were not when I first started in 2007.
Yeah.
So, and it grew way beyond my wildest dreams. I had no intention of turning it into a kind of practically a full-time business as it has become, but it just kept acquiring more followers and more word of mouth and positive feedback and all that. And so it's an everyday thing for me now.
Wow. How long ago did you start the account, the Instagram?
It's almost exactly 2 years ago. It was like late May of 2020.
Wow. So it's really taken off.
It really has. Yeah. I was very shocked, certainly.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I should have mentioned this in the beginning, but you obviously have a podcast too. So we'll talk a little bit about the podcast, what it's called, and how people can find it.
Sure. Well, it's also called Spycraft 101. So if you Google Spycraft 101, pretty much anything you see is going to be my work at this point. I started the podcast about a year after the Instagram account because I wanted to branch out a little bit more, and I wasn't sure whether I should do a YouTube channel or something like that, but I was getting a lot of encouragement from a lot of people, and I wanted to do a new format besides just a picture and 350 words on Instagram, and that was the way I found. So somebody that I knew from a few years back kind of put the idea in my head, and I said, now or never, might as well go for it. And so I started working with a production company, and that was a huge help because, I didn't know anything about editing. I didn't have any equipment, microphone, any of that. So they kind of cleared all the technical hurdles for me. And all I really had to do was find the guests and talk to them about the subjects that I'm interested in.
Right.
And it's worked out great. It's worked out great for them as well because the show almost immediately became one of their most popular shows because I already had this online following. And over the past year, I've just talked to some absolutely incredible people, some very, very, very highly educated, wonderfully talented historians and authors, people like Pulitzer Prize winning authors, David E. Hoffman, who wrote The $1 Billion Spy, had him on. I've had a Harvard history professor come on the show, and I've had real world people come on as well. I've had Air America pilots come on. I've had a couple of former CIA case officers, including one who was caught by the KGB in Moscow in 1986 in disguise. I mean, he went through everything that you can imagine, and he agreed to come on the show and talk about it. So, it's been quite a ride, and I've been able to explore some really, really amazing stories that just every week they blow my mind, just like they do the minds of the listeners, I think.
Yeah. It's a fascinating show to listen to. Each time I start an episode, I'm like, no way. He got someone to come on and talk about this, right? Like, it's kind of interesting to me because, Instagram had to be appealing because it was small content to start with, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not super hard to have a couple of pictures and words. I mean, I don't mean to minimize what you're doing at all, but that's way different than putting together an entire conversation or a book or whatever.
That's exactly right. And that's why I was able to do about one a day for the most part. It's still several hours of research and writing and reading and all of that. But, Instagram limits you to about 350 words in the caption. And I usually hit that. It's not hard for me to write 350 words on a topic at this point. I can do that pretty quickly, once I've got a good grasp of what I'm writing about. But the podcasts, that requires for me like 8 to 10 hours of prep work because I don't want to go into an interview where I have no idea what's about to happen or what's about to be said. So when I interview an author, I read their book ahead of time.
Right.
And I don't think that happens that often because when I've watched a few other interviews they've done, for, Fox News or whatever it might be, it's clear that the interviewer doesn't know anything going on. They're not asking the right questions or they're not asking the questions that I would ask and they don't get the full story. So that's what I try to do. I write down like 2 pages worth of questions beforehand. I've read the book. I know the answers to most of those questions before we even start recording, and it makes for a really good interview, I think.
It does. It really does. Yeah, it's a great show. So definitely check out Justin's podcast as well. We've talked before, and you said it well, right? We probably share a lot of common audience.
Yeah, I think we do.
A lot of people that like knife stuff would really enjoy your show when we've recommended it. It's been hugely popular in the feedback that we get from people, like, whoa, you guys are right, that's fascinating. And so there's a lot of crossover, I'm sure. So, well, very cool, man. So let's talk a little more about the guests on the podcast. You and I had an offline conversation about it, but I don't know what Tom and Sean's thoughts are, but there's some of the people you get are just, it blows my mind that they would talk to you basically being cold called, right? These aren't people that in most cases you're networked with somehow or have some kind of connection with to start, right?
Right, exactly. My very first 2 guests were people who were already on Instagram and I was already conversing with. It was one author and one former CIA case officer who's, pretty open about his past experience. So those were easy wins right there because we'd already had many, small conversations. But for episode 3, I basically cold pitched a guy, and it was the other CIA case officer I just mentioned, the guy who was arrested in Moscow in 1986.
Yeah.
His name was Michael Sellers, or is Michael Sellers. He's still alive, of course. And I just found him on social media. I found his website, then found him on social media, and I just sent a cold message, and he said yes. And I was just completely blown away, honestly, because I had nothing to offer. I didn't have an audience. I hadn't published a book. We didn't know any of the same people. But he was just willing to talk with a complete stranger about his experience. And that, even now, after over 40 episodes, that is certainly one of my top 5, maybe my top 3 episodes that I've done. And, as soon as he said yes, and as soon as we recorded that episode and it was incredible, I was thinking to myself, this really might be something here. This might, I might really get some serious people on here to share some incredible stories from their own lives.
Yeah.
He was, handcuffed. He was meeting a KGB source. He was trying to get a hold of a sample of something called spy dust, which there's actually a book called Spy Dust now, which you can buy online. And it was a material that had been developed by the Soviets, and they could track this material. So basically the idea was that they would take this dust, they could wipe it on a car door handle or on the back of someone's coat, and then they could track that material electronically all over the city. So if they thought that this was the car of a CIA case officer, for example, they would touch that car door handle and they could then follow that person all over the city without, being in eyesight of them. And so, of course, this was a very serious collection priority for the CIA. So he goes to a meeting with this source that they haven't seen in like a year to get a sample of this spy dust. And as soon as he gets to the meeting, he sees it in the guy's eyes that this guy is deeply afraid. And he's like, oh no, he knows it's a trap as soon as he sees the source's eyes. And that's what happened. The KGB swarms him. They've got the video cameras rolling. He's wearing a mustache and a watch cap and a disguise. He'd already spent like 3 hours crisscrossing the city to lose the KGB, but it didn't do any good because they were waiting for him at the meeting site. So they didn't have to follow him. Yeah, because they didn't need to follow him there. So he gets arrested. He's paraded in front of the cameras with all of his gear. His disguises, everything that he had with him at the time, the money that he was going to provide. All of that stuff is you can find that on YouTube now. And he gets kicked out of country a few days later, and the source is executed later on because that's what they did to their own people. Right. Although they always, let the CIA guys go because they have the diplomatic status. And just an incredible life lived. He went on to the Philippines. After that, he worked with Colonel Nick Rowe in the Philippines. You probably are familiar with him.
Yeah.
He was there when Nick Rowe died, I believe. And then he went on to a career in Hollywood as a screenwriter. Wow. So just a full life lived, and then he's talking to a nobody like me about it, which was amazing. And so that really set a benchmark for me, and I think I've been able to meet that benchmark with a few other episodes since then, certainly.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting that, like we talked before, maybe there's a little bit of snowball effect, which can't hurt your feelings, right? Like,
oh yeah,
you start to get a little bit of a legacy of guests coming on, and that makes sense that would open doors for additional people and people that might otherwise kind of, not look at you as someone that they should talk to, or, why bother?
Yep, it definitely does. And after 10 episodes or so, I had a good variety. I had a couple of published authors, a couple of real deal people, and I could just continue building from that. So that's my pitch every time. And I've had about a 50% success rate getting the people that I want on. And most of the 50% that don't come on, they just never even respond. So I'm not sure if they ever even saw the message. I've only ever gotten one flat out no. And that was when I was trying to go through a publishing company to get with a former Soviet agent who had written a book since he defected to the U.S.
Yeah.
And so they just told me he doesn't do interviews anymore. But everybody else, I'm still kind of hopeful they'll see that message one day, or I can, reconnect, try again in 6 months or something, and get some other big names on the show. But I've had some wonderful people so far, and I think that's going to continue for a while, honestly.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, and it starts out as a passion project kind of thing to do the research, and then suddenly, like you said, evolves into something where kind of a part-time thing, right? or
Right,
maybe
right.
more than part-time, depending on where it goes.
Full-time work, but not full-time salary. That's for sure. But, I think that's true at the beginning, at the outset of almost anything. You're not going to be an instant millionaire.
Yeah.
But even money aside, it provides a lot of satisfaction to me to find this stuff like it's genuinely interesting to me. And then I get really good feedback from people who are saying, just like you're saying, wow, I never knew about this. This is incredible. So it's very fulfilling, certainly.
Awesome. Tom or Sean, you guys had any questions before we dive into the Covert Arms book a little bit?
No, I actually haven't seen the Covert Arms book yet. I have it in my Amazon cart just now. I didn't know it was out, so
it's definitely cool. One of the things that
it looks cool.
Justin's doing is when you buy books, probably not through Amazon, you should buy it direct, Tom, because what do you tell the folks what you're including with the book?
Sure. Well, for a little bit of a backstory, there was a KGB museum in New York City, which almost nobody knows about because it opened and then it closed pretty quickly. So I think it opened in maybe 2018 or so, and it was run by a Russian guy. He brought over a lot of artifacts, KGB artifacts. He brought them over and put them on display in this small space in Manhattan. And then once the pandemic started, couldn't keep up the rent, and they had to close the museum. So everything was auctioned off. So that was a goldmine for a lot of people. And from the museum, I purchased all of their rubles at auction because they had an old Soviet safe on display that was opened up, and they had, just like thousands and thousands of Soviet rubles on display there, showing how they would process pay and, give bribes and source payments and that kind of thing. So you can find photos of it online of the open safe that was in the museum. So I got all the rubles, and I got their this is a little bit ridiculous, but I got the light up sign from the gift shop that says Spy Store. I bought that too. There's no way I could say no to that. No. And I knew that nobody else wanted it or needed it. I was the only one who would need that. So I'm like, it has to be mine. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's in my office right now. It's absurdly big. It's like 4 feet long, honestly. So I'm a little embarrassed to put it on display, but I've got it at least. So I wound up, I got a big box in the mail from the auction company later on, and it looked like, like in the movies when the narcos in Colombia, they have those giant bundles of money.
Yeah.
That they're shipping around. That's exactly what it was. It was like three 20-pound bundles of money wrapped up in heavy plastic, stapled shut and all that. So I showed my wife. I took a bunch of pictures and all that. It was amazing. Probably the only time I'll ever hold that amount of cash in my hand, even if it was from a country that no longer exists.
Yeah.
So anyway, I broke up on those, and I've been selling them piece by piece, but I also include a free 1 ruble note with every purchase from my store. I just throw one in there with a little note, hey, this came from the KGB Museum in New York City.
It's such a cool touch.
And I've still got a few left. Yeah, they've been a very popular item for sale. I sell one of the 1 and the 3, the 5, the 10, and the 25 ruble notes. And then I've got a lot of the singles, so I put those in with the books. I put them in with the sticker orders, that kind of thing.
That's super cool, man.
Yeah, it's very cool to see that those were in a safe on display with a bunch of KGB memorabilia. And I mean, those were not actually from the KGB. They didn't take them from the headquarters in Moscow or anything.
Yeah.
But they were at least on display at the museum.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah, they're going to run out eventually, but for now, I'm sending them out to everybody.
Right. Your vast ruble fortune is waning.
Yep. Maybe one day the International Spy Museum will close and I can grab some stuff from there too. Who knows?
Yeah, there you go. Spy shop sign is awesome.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, it's so cool.
You'd have to fight me for some of the stuff at the International Spy Museum.
Oh,
I know
man, yeah.
1 or 2 pieces there that I've had my eye on.
My gosh, yeah, I would pillage that place, honestly.
Yeah, we have this wonderful guest that's joined us before named Dr. Rachel Parikh, who's an arms and armor expert. And so she's told us about some of the arms storage areas at the museums where she's worked. And we always joke about how we're going to conspire with her to break into the museum and steal some kind of crazy, historic weapons. But
yep,
it's a great movie plot, even if it never comes to fruition. Because just to be on the record,
go to a good home.
It probably won't happen. I'm just saying it out loud.
Yep.
Yeah, we probably.
And if it does happen, you guys didn't do it.
We absolutely did not do it.
Yeah, get on the record with that.
Plausible deniability. Okay, so let's talk about the Covert Arms book. This book got my attention. I mean, both of them are fascinating. This one got my attention because it became the great opportunity or great excuse, really, to have you come on with us because we love combination weapons. Obviously, we're a knife podcast, so we like anything about knives. but there's a bunch of combination weapons in here. Some of them we've actually talked about in episodes. Maybe one of them we've talked about in an episode that hasn't been released yet, but there's just some fascinating stuff in here and some weird stuff, right? lots of bizarre ideas, clever, but bizarre ideas in the world of espionage, right? So,
oh, absolutely. Yeah. A lot of this stuff, it probably never saw the light of day, in terms of like field use, but it was an interesting idea. It was worth pursuing, but it was ultimately discarded. But there's still one or two available, whether it's in a museum or private hands or something. And there's a little bit of a story there. So it's been fun to track all that down and try to find out what became of all of these ideas.
Yeah. Did you start out on a mission to write this kind of book, or was it more of a thing where you came across enough stuff that, I should pull this into a collection?
Yeah, it was the latter, honestly. And I like weapons. I have a gun collection. I like shooting, all of that, but what really drew me to this world is the human element,
Yes.
where you have people betraying their coworkers, their friends, their family, everything, or the people that sacrifice everything for a country that they've never been to, which has happened many times.
Right.
And so that brought me in, but there's no way that you can separate. I don't want to separate espionage from covert action as well. So I've tried to find kind of a niche where I talk mostly about what came from these organizations, not so much like I don't get into MACV-SOG stuff for the most part.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that cover that. I don't have anything new to add to that conversation for the most part.
Right.
But, these organizations, in many cases, I think that if you have to resort to firearms or even knives, the mission is a complete failure. It's a complete disaster at this point, but not in every case. Sometimes that is the mission. And that was what I tried to cover in this book as much as I could. So after I wrote the first book, 101 True Tales from the World of Espionage, I thought, let me do a firearms or a weapons book next. And I was hoping to find 101 weapons, to keep that theme going. But
right.
I ended up with 64 chapters for this one.
Yeah.
And, found a lot of really interesting stuff along the way. So I chose to divide it up by country. So there are 4 main sections of this book. There's, I should say 5 sections. There's first section is weapons of the OSS, World War II, the Office of Strategic Services.
Yeah.
They developed some truly bizarre stuff and some truly effective stuff as well. After that, I've got the British Special Operations Executive, which was kind of their British counterpart during World War II, which has come up many times. In fact, I owe Sean big time, because Sean was the one that turned me on to one of the weapons that ended up in the book. It's this McClellan Pesket close combat weapon.
Oh, yeah.
Sean, I don't know if you knew if you recall that. That was one of your first messages to me like a year ago. And as soon as I saw that, I said, yeah, that's going in the book, certainly. So thanks for the hat tip on that one. I appreciate it.
And it's been a little passion of mine since I first saw one when I didn't see one in person, but I saw one mentioned in a Combat Arms magazine when I was 12.
Yeah.
And it stuck with me. I was like, yes, that is the dual tool.
Yeah. Exactly. They were trying, and it doesn't seem like in a lot of cases this kind of thing works out, but I think it was a very, very clever idea, and I would love to have one myself. It's like 3 different weapons in one?
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote a chapter about it, but I mean, you know it as well as I do, I'm certain.
So yeah, Sean definitely has a soft spot for the pesket. Maybe we've talked about it in an early episode. I think it's been a long time since we talked about it. We did a episode called Scary Knives, I think, that was all kinds of evil looking stuff. And we probably talked about there. Maybe we talked about it in another episode as well. But for the kids at home, can you explain what the pesket is? I know it's got a much longer name, but that's what I think of it as.
Sure. It was a small production device, multifunction device, I would call it. It was developed, let me see, what year was this? It was early World War II era, I think. It looks like about 48 of them were manufactured. And, they were made by hand is what it looks like. But it's a steel body device. It's got a weight at the end of it, for uses like a blackjack or a sap, a heavy steel ball at one end. And it's got a garrote wire spooled up on the inside, so you can pull out the garrote if you need to strangle anyone. And then it's got a gravity assist blade that drops out the bottom as well. So you've got an edged weapon, a garrote, and a blackjack all in in one combination device that you can carry in a sheath or something like that, and it had a wrist strap as well for holding on to it. Really, really clever idea, and it met a lot of needs that are still, in play with things like the ASP baton, that is extremely popular and around these days. But it did not quite catch on. Maybe it needed a little more refinement or something, but only about 48 of them were made, and it's a real oddity now. I think they're in museums and maybe a couple of private collections out there, but not much. The only one that I know of where it's at is in the collection of Peter Mason, and he's come up on the podcast a couple of times.
Yeah.
And he is a very, very well-known British operative, one of the many people that has been described as the inspiration for James Bond. And he's still alive at the moment, as far as I know. He's in his 90s, living in Canada, I believe, and just had a tremendous collection of weapons that he has mostly parted with. So one of them he's donated to collections to a couple of museums. So I'm not sure which one of the museums this ended up in, but I think it was a museum of World War II in Boston, Massachusetts. Got his pesket along with a bunch of his other gear, but unfortunately that museum closed in 2019, so that's not on display at the moment. So I'm not sure where else you might be able to see it.
Yeah, he sounds like a guy you need to get in the car and go visit.
I would love to. Yeah, I found somebody recently did an interview with. I say recently, over a year ago now. A Canadian veterans organization was able to go interview him. And so I contacted them, and they said that they sat down with him, but he asked that they not release the interview until after he passes, which could be soon, honestly, because he's in ill health and he's in his 90s. And I'm like, no, come on, Peter, please. The world needs your voice.
Yeah.
But he's been interviewed a few times. I have a VHS tape upstairs from a 1990s era documentary called Spy Tech.
Okay.
Tech is T-E-K, Spy Tech.
Okay.
And it was narrated by William Shatner. So I just picked that up off of eBay a little while back because he's interviewed in it in 1992 or something like that. But I don't have a VHS player anymore, so I haven't even been able to watch the tape yet. I know.
Wow.
So that's sitting there for me to get to eventually. But he's willing to talk about it, and he's written a couple of books about his experiences, but he's not done any talks recently that are available, unfortunately.
Crazy. Yeah, the pesket. Sean gets those cartoon character heart eyes when people start talking about the pesket. He loves that thing.
Oh yeah, I'm sure he could talk. He's probably known about it a lot longer than I have, so I'm sure he can provide some more detail on it.
What? So hit us with some other favorites from here, stuff that you think our audience will find interesting. I think they'd love all of them, but
yeah, I agree. It's hard to pick a favorite. What really stands out to me more is the use of them rather than the design. I didn't include in the book. I don't include a lot of statistics or manufacturing details or anything like that. That those things might appeal more to other people, but I was really looking for the stories behind who created them and what need were they trying to meet and were they used for that need in the end. And a lot of these were not, unfortunately. But some of my favorites. Let me see if I can pull this up really quick. I'm a big fan of the Bigot 1911 pistol, where they drop in a heavy steel dart in the front, so just firing like a 4-ounce steel dart into somebody at close range for almost silent. It was like a captive piston kind of design.
Yep.
And very minor modifications to a standard 1911 were required, and the problem with that is they couldn't get the accuracy dialed in quickly enough, because this was like 1942 that they were developing this. They needed solutions right now, because the war was on multiple fronts. U.S. was already gearing up for D-Day, which wouldn't come for quite some time, but they were supplying people behind enemy lines in France and occupied France and all over the place. So they did not spend a lot of time back then trying to dial in these solutions. If it wasn't immediately advantageous, then they would scratch these projects and move on.
Yeah.
At that point. But the Bigot is just as cool as it gets. You can find photos of it online. It's BIGOT. And it was just a dart firing modification to a standard 1911. And let me see, does it have the weight in here? Yeah, they would, it was just a 25 caliber blank round was preloaded into the dart. So when you get the dart, it's already got this blank round inside of it. And you slide it down onto a rod, which is inside the 1911. You've already inserted that into the 1911. And when you fire, this long firing pin inside the rod ignites the 25 caliber blank at the front of the dart and sends it downrange. And this was not very long range at all. It was 25 meters or so, I think was about as far as they were firing.
Yeah.
It was highly effective at that range, but it was not more effective than the high standard HDMS pistol, the 22 caliber silenced pistol that they were already using.
Right.
So this one kind of went to the scrap heap in the end. I think they had 20 of the kits were made for 1911s, and about 300 darts were produced on contract. And after testing, they just found that it didn't really provide any advantage over a more conventional suppressed 22. But, you know, hitting somebody with that dart, man, I'd love to see that, some ballistic gel testing on that, see what that does to somebody.
It's a pretty good sized dart. I just pulled it up. It's got
is.
like a modern nail type broadhead tip.
Yeah.
It would be cool to see what they could do with this now today with like the broadhead technology we have.
Oh, yeah.
But
I think it deserves a look and a longer development life cycle, you know, but they probably don't. I could look it up probably, but it was a matter of months from idea to going onto the discard pile. Honestly, they just didn't have a lot of time to devote, you know, more funds to something that wasn't immediately working.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Hush Puppy would be way better anyways because you got multiple shots. But cool idea.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if the fins were like broadhead blades. I mean, it'd go all the way down to the tip. And I mean, you could change the weight. I would guess it looks really tip heavy, and I would guess that would have to mess with the accuracy too. I mean, it looks basically like a large lawn dart or a small lawn dart. I don't want to get shot with it.
No, regardless of what's going on. It looks like the fins actually slide, Justin. So is it that this is actually a longer dart? And the fins slide back to the tail as it fires. Is that how that works?
Yeah. It's 4.5 inches into the barrel. You know, it's as long as a 1911 barrel.
Yeah.
So the fins do slide back just like you said, and lock into place at the bottom. So these darts, they do pop up occasionally on eBay and other, you know, military sites. I don't have one yet. I certainly want one.
Yeah.
And you can also get some of the what's the other dart that pops up every once in a while? Oh yeah, the SAC 46 darts, the poison tip darts that they were working on for a different project.
Okay.
Those pop up every now and again on eBay from what I've seen. So that was another very cool project called the Flying Dragon. They worked out a CO2 air gun, and the intent was to tip the darts with poison for taking out Japanese sentries, you know, in the nighttime, that kind of thing. And the U.S. has not done as much with poison as some other people have, but I was surprised to see them considering that in the early days of World War II.
Yeah. Tom's going to get flagged for searching poison darts on eBay. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm deeply concerned about what my Google search history does. I can clear the cache every day, but I don't think that's enough, honestly.
I guarantee I'm already on their list. It's okay.
Yeah, I know it.
Too funny. Yeah, the biggest one I had a bookmark on in the book, so it's funny that you picked that one. Another one I thought is really interesting is there's a couple versions of the same kind of thing. There's the Colt hold-up gun, and then there's another one that's very similar to it. It looked like a remote pistol type thing.
Yes. Yeah, the Colt hold-up gun and the remote control pistol by the British. So two different designs with a very similar concept there, and the British design was much more refined. It was still a bizarre idea and not really workable, but it was significantly ahead of the OSS design. So the OSS model, it did not go far in training. I don't think anybody thought this was a real good idea, but you can kind of understand the reasoning of it, but you can also see how it would not have worked out at all. So the idea between this, but for this hold-up gun, was for someone who is being detained because, you know, as example, in France, in fact, in an episode that I just did a few days ago that just debuted this week, we talked about how the counterintelligence was very, very good for these agents that were working behind occupied lines. They were in serious danger all the time, and they were constantly being caught. And so the idea of this hold-up gun was that if you're being arrested by the collaborating French authorities of Vichy French or the German Gestapo, you know, or whatever is the threat in the country that you're deployed to, you're wearing this gun on a chest plate underneath your coat. It's facing forward. It's mounted under one of your underarms, your right underarm. So when you've got your hands up in the air, showing that you're unarmed, you can still fire a round through your coat into the person trying to detain you. Right then. So, I mean, it does make sense. It would be very advantageous to fire a round at somebody while your hands are up in the air, but the execution and all the problems that come along with it were terrible. So it didn't go very far, but it makes for a couple of really cool pictures. They developed this curved chest plate that, goes around the right side of your rib cage there. It hangs by a strap, and it's got a really simple trigger mechanism that's attached to the weapons trigger. They started with just a Colt 25 ACP for some reason. Very small pistol on a very large chest plate. And the initial idea for the trigger mechanism, which is terrible, is they just wrapped all the way around the circumference of your chest. So when you needed to fire the round without using your hands, you would simply take a deep breath and you'd expand your lungs, expand your chest circumference, and that would trigger a round out of the way, straightforward.
Right.
Well,
That seems like a bad idea.
yeah, it really does, because when you think about it, if you're the moments leading up to an arrest by the Gestapo, your heart rate's already going to be up, your breathing's already going to be up. You're probably going to shoot your partner, while you're trying to race away from the scene or something like that. You're going to be firing rounds as you run, from this magazine, long before you're standing with somebody right in front of you. So, just not a workable solution at all. But they were willing to try everything and see what worked and what didn't. So this didn't get very far, but there's a couple of really cool pictures of it out there. It's an interesting concept. So when the British tried something similar, they did a much better job with it overall, and it might have actually been sent out into the field, although that's kind of up for debate right now. So the British version was called the remote control pistol, and just taking one look at, and when I say remote control pistol, that's three separate words. The remote control pistol was a 1903 in their case, so it was already a little bit bigger. It was a 380 caliber pistol instead of a 25, so already a little bit better off right there. It had a much better design all the way around, a much stronger waistband, and the actuator for the trigger was a wire that would run all the way up your sleeve to your finger. So you would have it on your finger, and you could trigger around from this cable down through your sleeve and out your coat as necessary. So if you take a look, it's a much better setup. You could also reload the pistol. There was the brace that was holding it into the belt was open at the bottom, so you could actually drop the magazine, insert the magazine without taking it off your belt if you needed to. And it was just a much better setup. So most of my information about that one actually comes from a guy that I've been in contact with, and I kind of want to do a shout out to him. His name is Anders Thygesen. He is a wonderful resource for anything related to World War II clandestine operations in Europe. Very, very knowledgeable guy that I have communicated with on many occasions. If you're on Instagram, he goes by @SOE4045. He has a fairly small following, but he's got wonderful photos of all of this clandestine gear from World War II. He's in the museums. He's got great contacts. He can put this stuff on. He can do long write-ups about everything. So he's been a huge help with my research in the past, and I'm really thankful to him because a lot of this book, the British stuff, I owe to him, honestly. But this remote control pistol, it appears that it was deployed at least one time during an operation called Chilblain, which is early in World War II. I think 1942, a couple of operatives dropped into, I think it was Holland, if I remember correctly. And they were carrying quite a few weapons. I think they had like a dozen weapons with them because they were going to distribute them to the partisans there once they landed on the ground. And unfortunately, one of the guys who was flying out, this was in the very, very early days of airborne operations. They're doing this incredibly risky night drop, when hardly anybody's done this before. The ring on his parachute on the snap line in the aircraft, it breaks, like the D-ring or whatever is holding it on, it breaks, so his parachute doesn't actually deploy when he jumps out. Ooh. So this poor guy hits the ground and he's killed instantly. And this was one of their very first parachute operations, so they had to, replace that D-ring device later on, but it didn't do this poor guy any good at all. So he dies. He lands on the ground. The local authorities, the Germans, they find a dead guy in a field, and he's got all this equipment with him, including like a dozen pistols, a whole bunch of clandestine stuff, and he's got a remote control pistol apparatus in his bag. He's not wearing it, but he's got the apparatus in his bag. And so they see this, and they're like, what in the world is this thing? We've never seen, we recognize a pistol, but not this device it's attached to. So you can find some photos in the book and online as well. The German police, they go back and they try it on, they check it out, they evaluate it, and they realize that this is actually a pretty serious threat to their local authorities because the arrest standard at that time is very different than what happens these days. Back then, when they would arrest someone, they would reach out and they put a hand on their shoulder to kind of assert dominance, and they'd say, "You're under arrest." So they're facing the guy, they're arm's length away, standing right in front of him with a hand on the shoulder. So that's a perfect opportunity to shoot somebody from the waist with a waist-mounted pistol.
Right.
So it's already making a lot more sense than the American version at that point. So they took a bunch of photos and they sent out some alerts to the local authorities to watch out for this. Just because somebody's surrendering to you doesn't mean that they are not a threat anymore. But there's not any other reports of this being used, any conclusive reports of this being used effectively. So I'm not sure if it was ever actually used by anybody to save their own life. It might have been carried on one other mission, but nobody's entirely sure. And that's the very, very famous Operation Anthropoid, which there's been a movie about it recently made. This operation to kill Reinhard Heydrich.
Okay.
Very, very well-known Nazi. He was like number 3 in the Nazi organization. He was in charge of Occupy Czechoslovakia. So some Czech agents dropped into Prague in Czechoslovakia, and they ended up assassinating him in a daring attack, like handguns and grenades against his armored vehicle and his bodyguards.
Oh, wow.
So they killed him, and they were eventually hunted down and killed. And thousands of Czechoslovakian innocents were killed in reprisals as well. They basically massacred an entire village as reprisals for this attack. But it's thought that maybe these guys also carried one of the remote control pistols, but it's not been confirmed.
Huh.
So, I have to wonder, is it still out there? Honestly, that's a lot of these weapons that were airdropped in. They might be rusting away somewhere right now in, Czechoslovakia, Albania, maybe in some cache in a forest, 4 feet down.
Right.
Something like that. I think a lot of stuff is still out there, honestly.
Yeah. Right. Just hidden away or picked up by a farmer or something. Who knows, right?
Yeah. I mean, they have been found. They certainly have been found.
Wow.
Many years afterwards.
Crazy stuff. I don't know if it was you or Sean. Somebody turned me on to that account because I follow that account already. SOE4045 is the Instagram account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's a great guy. And he's got a website. It's like timelapse.dk, I think.
Yep.
If I remember correctly. But if you enjoy this stuff, spend a couple hours reading up on everything he's written because he's great.
Yeah. And he's got fantastic pictures.
Yeah, he really does.
Yeah. Wonderful. Remote control pistol. I love that. Well, I love the idea anyway.
I know it would be fun. It's the perfect kind of thing these days, like to do a video evaluating it, something like that. I'd love to see this at the range, the pros and cons of it.
Oh yeah.
They didn't have that. They didn't have that advantage back then. Like they put this together. It was a local gunsmith. He put this together pretty quickly, just a few dozen of them as well. And and they were sending it out into the field. That's how desperate it was. They were like, anything that might work, let's try it. They real world use right away. That's the testing ground.
Yep.
So pretty incredible stuff.
Yeah. Let's talk about some stabby stuff. So on the smoking pipe dagger, I thought was really, really cool.
Yes. That was, I don't think many of these were made. It's kind of like a one-off design. And this is really just an example of how clever these guys were with disguised items all the time. This particular picture, this one came up for auction about 18 months ago.
Oh, really?
I would say. I don't recall the final price of it, probably, $2,000, $3,000, something like that. But this one was available. So this is in private hands right now, the one that's pictured here.
Wow.
And if you take a look, it's I'm not a pipe smoker, so I can't really say, but it's a very standard looking tobacco pipe to me. And then you pull off the shaft and there's a needle blade inside, and it's held in there by like a 303 cartridge case. So they were just improvising everything at that time, which is amazing. But it was developed by this guy, this blade, this smoking pipe dagger, and many, many other items were developed by this guy named Charles Fraser Smith, who was kind of like the master of disguise for the British in World War II. He was in charge of an organization called MI9.
Yep.
MI9, there's MI5 and MI6 that most everybody knows about, but he was in charge of MI9.
Okay.
And a lot of what he was developing, they're doing small batches of stuff. Everything is disguised. Everything is like a hairbrush with a map hidden inside of it, or a uniform button that's actually a compass, just all kinds of stuff. And they were sending it out either on people who had a high likelihood of being captured, or they were sending it in care packages to the POW camps. Because during the war, these POWs, they could still receive care packages from international aid organizations. So a lot of the American and British governments, they created fictitious aid organizations, and then they would ship all these clandestine hidden items to the POW camps to allow these guys to make a plan to escape. Basically, there was not a huge amount of success, not a huge number of prisoners were able to escape, but I'm sure it was a big morale booster when you're getting this stuff that's been very carefully crafted to give you the best possible chance of escaping and then navigating your way to safety once you actually do escape out of the prison camp.
Oh, yeah.
So this was one of the, I'm not sure if this was given to an agent or if this was maybe sent in a package to allow them to try and, kill a sentry and make their way out of the wire or something like that. Because a lot of this stuff is not super well documented, unfortunately, but very, very cool idea for a pipe. The only problem I see with it is you can't actually smoke it,
right? Right.
But smoke with it. So that might, not pass the sniff test, so to speak. But
yeah,
other than that, I think it's a fantastic little design.
I think with a little more work, you could for sure.
Oh yeah,
you could make it work, right? You could have a hole in the spike or down the center or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, I'm visualizing Sean out in the shop with this thing in his mouth, just waiting for somebody to try to come through the door.
Yeah, these guys. So this guy Charles Fraser Smith, he eventually became known as the guy who was making the Q gadgets, and he took the name Q from Q ships, which was something that the Brits were using already in World War II, and they were basically merchant ships that actually had hidden and disguised weaponry to allow them to defend against U-boat attacks, that thought they were attacking an unarmed target.
Right.
So because he was calling them Q gadgets, it's very widely believed that he was the inspiration for Q in the 007 books and films later on. And it makes a lot of sense because he was the gadget guy he was like the senior lead gadget guy for British intelligence and British POWs during the war. So he's a perfect stand-in, a perfect inspiration for Q from the Bond films.
No doubt. Gadget Guy is a fine title.
It really is. Yeah, he made some amazing stuff. They put such tremendous amount of work into hiding all of this stuff because it had to be, a Nazi guard could open this up at the POW camp and see if it's really a shoeshine kit, or a shirt or something like that, or if it's not. So it had to pass a very close examination to actually make its way to the POWs.
Right. There's a couple in here that we've talked about before. The Tyne dagger is one. I think in this one of these recent episodes we did on daggers, we talked about the Tyne dagger. I think Michael brought it up, didn't he? So
yeah, I heard that episode. That was interesting. I was glad to see you guys already talking about it.
Yeah. So that's basically a pitchfork tine turned into a kind of a clever, sneaky stabbing implement.
Yeah, that's amazing improvisation. They're like everything is a weapon. Right. I really love that mentality.
Yeah.
And of course, something that's already designed for stabbing. Yeah, of course that's a weapon. But even so, a pitchfork would be a very common implement, I would think, in rural Europe in the 1940s.
Yes.
And you find one of those and you've got at least 3 potential improvised blades, maybe 4, maybe 5.
Right.
Right there.
Yep.
So just the crudest thing imaginable, but it would potentially get the job done. And what I like about it is how easy it would be to hide up like your sleeve of your forearm, something like that, and you've got it, and it'll get you a better weapon after that, I would imagine.
Exactly. You could upgrade quickly.
Yeah. Yep.
So sandwiched between that and the OSS thumb dagger is one we got to come back to in the weird weapons part, but the OSS thumb dagger is in here, well mentioned, right? It's kind of a legendary implement.
Yep.
So we've talked about the thumb dagger a bunch on the show and modern interpretations of it. Tom's made some. Tom's talked about a couple other people that have made some really cool ones in recent history. Can you give people a little more of the history on the lapel dagger or the thumb dagger?
Some of the stuff, honestly, Mark, I've told so many stories that in the past couple of years that they kind of start to run together.
Oh yeah,
sometimes, doubt. And I start mixing up who was involved with what or what year something happened, and I shouldn't be admitting that. Probably it's going to cast doubt on everything that I say and do from now on. But it's a little bit of information overload at times.
Yeah.
But these thumb daggers, they're still around. They're highly collectible. Of course, I'm sure you guys know that better than I do. But the very, very tiny, and they were often called lapel daggers as well.
Yep. Because
they could be hidden underneath the lapel of your coat, because a lot more guys were wearing coats back then, of course.
Right.
So you could sew them into just about anything. They're like 2.5, 3 inches long at times. Yeah, this one's I've gotten here. It looks like it's maybe 3 inches long at most. And I don't think of this I mean, you guys might disagree. I don't really think of this as a killing implement. It's more of a distraction device to me because it's so small, and it's there when you need it. If you've got it hidden, it certainly is there, and it's better than nothing. It's better than empty hands for a lot of people, I would imagine. But I thought of it as more of a distraction device to allow you to get in a couple of quick hits and either escape or wrestle away a better weapon from the person who's trying to detain you at that time.
Yep.
But it's so small and so hard to hold on to because you're basically just using two of your fingers there, your thumb and your forefinger, that I can't imagine you really like getting to vital organs with that kind of thing.
I don't know. The throat's pretty soft.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
Eyeballs.
maybe eyeball,
Eyeballs.
something like that.
Stick that in somebody's throat and they're going to have a bad day.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And actually getting back to Peter Mason, who I just talked about a few minutes ago, he had a big collection which included these thumb daggers. And I've got a diagram in the book which he drew himself, and he would show how to use the thumb daggers. And he had a retaining cord there. So he's got several different methods for using it in the book for ways to hold it. He could use it as a, like a punch dagger or a push dagger, excuse me.
Yep.
But you have to have that retained on a cord. So if you don't have a cord, then you're out of luck with that. But, easily concealed in your hand, small enough to just disappear into the palm. And then you can swivel it around on that little loop on your finger and use it as a punch dagger potentially. Yeah. So he had some very good ideas. Certainly. He was probably one of the masters of his craft in the day.
It's such a cool item. We've talked about it a lot, but I think it's just a fascinating one. Let's ask our resident. He'll do almost anything when prompted. Tom Krein. Tom, have you ever actually stabbed something with a punch dagger?
With a punch dagger?
I mean, I'm sorry, with a OSS thumb dagger.
No, I haven't.
No?
I should.
I was going to say, how could you have a cantaloupe or a watermelon or a pumpkin around and not want to stab it with that?
It seems like I need a roast or something.
Yeah, that could work too.
I'm going to stab my brother with a chisel once. That doesn't count though, right?
I'm just going to say, eventually, with the way this year's going by really fast, we're going to get to Thanksgiving quick, and I expect to see a thumb dagger stuck in the turkey at Thanksgiving time, at a minimum.
Well, I'm doing a new one out of titanium, and maybe we'll just need to test it on some roast cold steel style.
There you go. Doing anything cold steel style is kind of a winner.
I don't know if I have any stretch shorts, though.
We can take care of that. I got an Amazon account.
Yes, we have people.
You wear a small, right?
Well, I mean, for this, I would have to, obviously.
Yes, the extra tight version.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Jeez.
I'm looking at what else is in here. I had a couple of them marked. One of them was the knuckle duster revolver that had this kind of a combination weapon style thing, right?
Yes. That was tough to pull out some info.
I bet.
And certainly. There's basically, as far as I can tell, there's one of those in a museum somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's not a glowing recommendation for it by any means. But there were a lot of those designs back in the 1800s, and only one that I could find that was implemented around World War II era.
Yeah.
But it was called the Commando revolver. It was developed by somebody within the British government. I'm not even sure that we have that information. It was really cool. I like the idea a lot, and it's an interesting evolution of a design that was much more popular like 100 years ago.
Right.
So back in the 1860s, well, 80 years before, back in the 1860s, a lot of these were showing up in France. These Parisian gangs were called the Apaches, and they were carrying these because they're concealable. It's like for the people who can't see it at home right now, the knuckle dusters are the grip of the revolver. They fold down, so it's very compact. And there's even a folding blade that runs along underneath the cylinder of the revolver. So it's another 3-in-1 kind of weapon. And it's not very aesthetic. It's not very good looking. It doesn't even have a trigger guard for the trigger, which seems pretty dangerous to me. It does have a concealed hammer there, which I guess makes it easier for drawing or putting it back in your pocket or wherever have you. But this was developed for the commandos. Obviously, it's called the Commando revolver, and it was a 9x19 revolver, actually, which is pretty darn rare,
yeah,
I think. But that was the standard issue pistol cartridge of the day, so it makes perfect sense that they would want to chamber it in a round that was already being manufactured in the millions at that point.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it was ever issued or carried by anybody. I couldn't find anything about that, but there's at least one in a museum. It was probably just a one-off prototype, and they decided to not move forward with that as they did with so many other weapons. But it's a cool idea, and I think it has a lot of usefulness in some limited circumstances.
Right.
Yeah, it didn't even have any sights or anything, so you're basically got to be right there.
Yeah.
It's point blank range, if you're going to use that. But it's also, I like that it's heavy enough that it's got to weigh about a pound probably, all steel construction like it is. So that's a really good non-lethal implement as well.
Right. So it looks like the trigger folds up.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the knuckle duster part folds forward, or does it stay like that? The way it's
I could not find a picture of it. Yeah, it makes sense that it would.
Yeah.
But I couldn't find a picture of it folded anywhere. But I mean, it would be so awkward to carry.
What? Sean doing research live?
Just a second.
Okay, sure.
All right. Sean's on the job over there.
I'm kind of fascinated with some of the Russian stuff.
Oh yeah.
The MSP Groza.
Oh man, yeah, that's one of my favorites.
I don't understand how that works. I don't. I want to understand. Have you seen it, Mark?
I think there's one in Justin's book, right?
It's a little double barrel 7.62 by 39, and it looks just like a Derringer, but it's suppressed, and I don't know how. Somehow the gas doesn't leave.
You know what? Justin's got a gun in here that's got a silent round, right? What's that?
The captive piston rounds.
Yeah.
This is a standard 7.62 by 39, it looks like.
How the heck do you have a 7.62 by 39 in a Derringer? That's what you're talking about, right? How does it work?
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like one. Certainly, it's not internally. It's very different, but it does look that way. Certainly, that's a standard 7.62 cartridge case, and I think the bullet as well. But it's a captive piston inside. So I think I have a diagram of it in one of these chapters. But basically, there's a much smaller amount of powder than a normal rifle round inside, and there is a piston like a plunger device which seals up the cavity as it's fired. So the gunpowder, it starts expanding. It pushes this piston forward, and the front of the piston comes in contact with the bullet and pushes it out the barrel at subsonic velocity. And at the same time, it's also sealing the cartridge so that none of the expanding gases escape. So you've got a self-sealing cartridge that has just ejected this round practically silently, because without any of the gases expanding, escaping, there's virtually no sound. So you can find a video on YouTube of a guy shooting one of these out in a field, like a Russian soldier, shooting one of these, and you basically only hear the click of the hammer as he fires the round, or the striker, I mean. But it's quite amazing. Yeah, if you look around on YouTube, you can find it with the MSP Groza live fire video.
Yeah. And it also, it's supposed to throw them off because it's a rifle caliber bullet, the same as what's fired out of an AK.
Right, yeah. If you find somebody
really
that's been hit by what is clearly a rifle round, you're not going to be looking at the guy who was behind him on the sidewalk that everybody was looking at and didn't see or hear anything.
Right.
Yeah, it was the M43 bullet, which was standard Warsaw packed round.
Yeah, really cool.
Yeah, they have a lot of weapons. This is what's called the SP3 cartridge, and they had a lot of weapons that were either use this cartridge or another variant of that. They use this captive piston quite a few different times over the years, probably still using it right now. Certainly some of these are gathering dust in an armory, of some Russian unit at the moment. Might be a few in Ukraine right now, as a matter of fact.
I would love to see the cut down, like how that works. That'd be really cool.
Yeah, there's pictures. I'm not sure if I included, I think maybe in a different chapter, because there's so many of the weapons I cover use these captive piston rounds. If you look through, I think I have one.
Well, I did order your book just a couple minutes ago.
Oh, okay, that's right. Yeah.
Once
site. You get it, take a look.
Off your site, not Amazon. Nope. Because I want a ruble.
Yeah, you'll get one certainly. But yeah, this Groza, it was such a cool idea, and they had several evolutions of this. There's several similar looking two-shot Derringer-style pistols that fire this very heavy round, subsonic velocities. Super quiet. Obviously doesn't eject around, so there's virtually no evidence of what happened when you use this. And I found some hints, I mean, just like whispers, I would almost describe it, that this was used in Central America at some point, but I don't know on who, I don't know what country, I don't know what year. I hope that information comes out, but the Russian government, the old Soviet stuff, has never really come out in the open in the way that a lot of, like CIA stuff and OSS stuff has been declassified.
Right.
So I think a lot of people would maybe be surprised to learn that the CIA is surprisingly open about their past history compared to other countries' organizations. I mean, you can laugh and say, of course, they're hiding some really damaging stuff. Of course, they're hiding their worst stuff, which one of them killed Kennedy or, whatever you want to say. Yeah. But they do have a declassification schedule and they stick with it. And it's been a good resource for me in the past, for stuff that was from 40 or 50 years ago. But almost nothing from the British military intelligence, British organizations has been declassified. They have the Official Secrets Act over there, and it's much more strenuous than U.S. law. So most of their stuff, even from many, many decades ago, is still classified. And most of what is in the old Soviet archives has not seen the light of day. Just a little bit is leaked out, and it's been enough to generate some very interesting books. But I would say that 90% of what the Soviet intelligence agencies were doing during the Cold War is still unknown.
Yeah. Probably got some
That's
people
unfortunate.
Snuffed out in the process too.
Yeah.
Information leaking
They
out.
killed a lot.
Right.
Yeah, they certainly killed a lot. I've talked quite a bit. They use poison in a way that most other countries apparently do not. They've got a very well-documented history of using poison.
Right.
And when I say well-documented, we only know the ones that they found poison in their system afterwards.
Right.
Because so many of their poisons gave the appearance of a heart attack. So, a middle-aged guy in a stressful position, a defector or a dissident or a journalist or whoever, he keels over from a heart attack. There's nothing surprising about that at all. It happens every day, 100 times a day, probably. And so some of those guys in the past were unquestionably, they were poisoned and it never came to light.
Right. Don't they do some radioactive stuff too, right? That's like a slow motion thing.
Yeah. Polonium. They used that on a guy named Litvinenko in London, very famously in 2006. And I talked about that on a podcast episode a while back.
Yeah.
They've used some thallium poisoning. Previously, there was a guy named Nikolai Koklov who I've talked about, and he was poisoned. He survived in 1956 is when they poisoned him because he had defected in 1953. And, his hair all fell out. He swole up, really inflamed. Eyes were bleeding, just all kinds of terrible stuff. But he did actually survive that poisoning. And
Did
lived
one of
for
those
many more
use an
years.
umbrella?
Yeah, that's in the book too. They got a guy named Georgy Markov in London in 1978. He was a Bulgarian writer and an expat. He was a dissident. He was writing a lot of very critical stuff about the Bulgarian president at the time. And the Bulgarian president was very vindictive. Even though the guy was, living outside the country, he couldn't allow him to keep living, basically. And he even had, if I remember correctly, he had written some plays and that sort of thing. So he had the president took all of this guy Markov's books out of the libraries and struck his name from the credits of everything he had worked in, just kind of disappearing him, basically. Wow. I mean, it's petty, you know what I mean? Like that just kind of gives more credentials to what Markov is saying and writing. But anyway, that wasn't enough. He had to get the guy killed. So he sought assistance from the Soviets, or maybe the Soviets presented or offered some assistance anyway. They sent some specialists and they discussed several different methods for trying to get to Markov in London. And that's a big deal. Like, killing somebody in the British capital was a very serious thing. That happens a lot in movies, but it was much more serious. It had a lot more potential ramifications for, their international relations if they were found out. So they discussed a few different things, poisoning his food, which is a pretty conventional way of going about it. They came up with an idea for like a gel that they would smear on his skin, and that would be enough to poison him through his skin cells. And they also came up with the idea of firing a pellet of some sort from a disguised weapon. And so that's what they went with. So they developed this tiny little pellet. I think it's 1.5 millimeters wide. And the pellet itself had a couple of like practically microscopic holes drilled in it. And so they put a tiny bit of poison inside this pellet, and then they sealed up the holes with like this, like a gum kind of substance that would dissolve at 98.6 degrees. Inside a human body, this stuff would dissolve. So they created an umbrella that was like a CO2 gun. The shaft of the umbrella was a CO2 firing weapon.
Yep.
And they tested it a couple of ways. And because they're the Soviets, because they're the Bulgarians, they did a live test on a prisoner. First, they shot a horse.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So they shot a horse. I think the horse died. Then they killed a prisoner, or they shot a prisoner with it who had already been sentenced to death. And it's very odd, like how do you get an umbrella next to a prisoner? I think he was like walking around the yard during visitation or something. It's a little bit confusing. But they basically got this prisoner with the umbrella gun, and this guy, he felt something, and he knew that something was wrong, and he knew that he had a death sentence coming. So he correctly and justifiably freaked out because he realized that something had just happened and he was about to die. And so he got very sick, but he ended up surviving. So they adjusted the poison and they adjusted the weapon a little bit more. And then for the final test, they went after another dissident who had escaped. Let me find that guy's name really quick. Yeah, a guy named Vladimir Kostov. He was a defector who was living in Paris. So they decided to get him for the field test with the weapon. And they shot him on an escalator at a mall or something like that. But he was wearing a heavy sweater. So it didn't fully penetrate through the sweater. The little pellet didn't. And he got really sick, but he survived.
Wow.
So after that, they made one more adjustment. They're like, all right, we're ready to do it. So they got Markov in London in 1978. He was walking across a bridge in the city one day by himself, and he felt a little sting in his calf. And he turned around, and some guy behind him walking on the bridge had dropped an umbrella. And the guy picked up the umbrella, and a taxi pulled up right beside him, and the guy got into the taxi and drove away. And Markov was like, man, that was weird. What's going on there? So a couple days later, he's feeling horribly sick. He goes to the hospital, and he tells his doctor what happened, and then he tells him, I'm a dissident writer. The Bulgarian president is out to get me personally. He wants me dead. And the doctor is like, okay, sure, guy, whatever. That I don't think you're the victim of a globe-trotting conspiracy.
Right.
But he was. He completely was. And so he passed away in the hospital. And when the police came for the postmortem, and they were like, wait a minute, this guy really was a dissident. He really was under threat of death. And now he's died under these really mysterious circumstances. So a lot of investigation happened. They determined who it was. They did eventually find the assassin. Like over 20 years later, they found the guy who did it. And I have his name somewhere. I can't recall right now. But he never went to jail for it because he got away with it. He was like an antiques dealer. That was his cover.
Oh, wow.
And he's living in Italy now, if I remember correctly. He like an ardent communist who was willing to be one of their special helpers.
Yeah.
So he got away with it. Markov died, scared off untold, how many other dissidents over the years because they know that they'll still come and get you even years later.
Right.
And the umbrella itself was never recovered. So there are several models of the umbrella in several different museums. I think there's at least 3 that I'm aware of now. I think I mentioned 2 in the book, but there's another one that came to light recently. But nobody ever recovered the umbrella. So they're basically mock-ups of the design, or they're recreations of it.
Yeah.
And I have read that when the Bulgarian government crumbled, in like 1988, 89, like all the other governments were falling around that time, that there was a stockpile of these umbrella weapons that was found, but it's never turned up like conclusively that I'm aware of. So, maybe they're out there in some Bulgarian archive or something like that, but I'm just really not sure. But Markov definitely died. It was definitely the poison. They, conclusively proved that with his autopsy. They've recovered the pellet. That guy Kostov that was shot, what was amazing was that when Kostov was shot, he survived and he didn't have the pellet removed. He didn't have surgery or anything like that. It was still stuck inside of him. So when Markov was killed later on, Kostov went to the police and he said, hey, I think I've got the murder weapon in me right now.
Yeah.
So they surgically removed the pellet from his back and they examined it, and they were able to learn a lot from that as well, because not all the poison had released into his system. So they were able to like forensically examine that and find out what had happened.
Oh, wow.
Just a crazy story. And this is 44 years ago.
Yeah.
They've only improved since then. So just some wild stuff, really.
Wow. The Bulgarian president went like full crazy ex-girlfriend on that guy.
Yeah, he really did.
That's nutty.
What was that guy's name? Yeah, Todor Zivkov was the guy's name. Yeah, he was angry and he was powerful.
Yeah. That's nutty, man.
I know. Yeah, I feel bad for Markov, but I do kind of love that story as well. It makes for some entertaining reading.
No kidding. So, Justin, I sent you a picture that Sean found of that knuckle duster pistol.
Oh, yeah. There it is. Okay, so it does fold.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty handy. Honestly, I mean, I like it, especially folded like that. I'm not sure if I've seen that photo before.
It's definitely cool that, with if you had the blade down or even up for that matter, then it's like a baby trench knife almost kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it very much looks like that.
Wow.
Seems like the barrel would limit penetration of your knife
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yep.
Maybe.
Yeah. It's definitely a funky one. Maybe it makes sense why there's only one, but it's still cool.
Yeah. I love to see people just try something new.
Yeah.
Especially when it doesn't just go in the trash heap, it winds up in a museum or something like that. And, it might be an example of a failure, but it's still something that we can learn from even now. And it's good to see the mindset that went into these things and the ideas behind the design. Even if they didn't work out, they eventually got there in the end.
Yeah. So one of the ones I thought was really interesting in the book is something called the gyrojet rocket pistol.
Oh, man. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by that. So the cartridge is actually like, it really is jet propelled or rocket propelled, I guess is a better way to say it.
Yeah. They're incredible. And I have a pretty good write-up in it. I have a reference book at home that anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff should pick up. It's by Mel Carpenter is his name. I think he's very well known in the in the cartridge collecting world. Mel Carpenter, from what I can tell, he's pretty well respected and prolific writer.
Okay.
In that world. But he wrote a book, and I picked it up from him a while back, and it was a wonderful resource for this book as well. He's like the gyrojet expert, certainly, because they came up with a lot of really bizarre stuff. It was a very, very creative and forward-thinking company, and not hugely successful in the end, but just like a wonderful footnote to history, really, just everything this company did. So tons of great photos in his book, tons of great information. He really dug into it. It was really fascinating stuff. So I was able to devote a chapter of the book that was largely based on his research as well. But this gyrojet pistol, yeah, the idea was it was virtually recoilless, a self-contained 13 millimeter wide rocket that's slightly larger than a 45 caliber round, basically. But it fires with almost no recoil, and it doesn't expend a shell because it's self-contained. So there were some. They came up with a lot of different ideas for how they could incorporate self-propelled rockets into weaponry. Just some really, really interesting stuff. They considered using them as an anti-tank mine device. So like a tank could be rolling across the battlefield, and it's got like a salvo launcher in the back with hundreds and hundreds of these tiny rockets, and they launch them ahead of them, and these rockets land in the path and they detonate any mines.
Yeah. It
was not the exact same rocket. It was not a 13 millimeter handheld rocket, but it was a different one. But just a wide variety of ways that they could use this. They thought about dropping a lot of like flechette type devices into South Vietnam, and it would allow the South Vietnamese farmers, like untrained, uneducated farmers, to kind of defend themselves against the Viet Cong and the MVA who were infiltrating the area. They wanted to give them these really cool like multi-barrel flechette pistols that were like, to fire a salvo of rockets basically with every trigger pull.
Wow.
And so you don't need any training with that really, because it's like a spread kind of weapon,
Yeah.
So not a lot of accuracy needed. So one of the things that they came up with, and it's probably their I would say their longest lasting impact and their best known product, was these 13 millimeter gyrojet pistols. They offered them to the military. They were hoping to get those accepted as the sidearm of the future, basically. That ended up not happening, and there were a few reasons, but one of the reasons was that at the scale that they were manufacturing at, they were not able to scale up to a giant production like a Winchester or somebody like that. So the rockets were still very expensive. They're like $1 each, even back in the 1960s. So tremendously expensive per round at the time. And they didn't win any big enough contracts to really get that price down by manufacturing at scale, unfortunately. But the rockets had a big problem. Another problem was that at very close ranges, they were not especially effective, because when they're leaving the barrel, unlike a conventional round, they're still accelerating. So because the rocket just ignited, so it's speeding up for the first portion of its travel outside the barrel. So it was not really good at like less than 15 meters. It was not a very ballistically impressive weapon. And, there are plenty of engagements, of course, that happen at 15 meters or closer. So that was a big negative for it. But it was at the same time a really, really cool design, very retro futuristic look to it. They developed some carbines as well but they never quite caught on. You know, they were expensive. The ammo was expensive. It was a unusual kind of design. One of the other benefits was that you could fire them underwater. It wasn't like a conventional round, and they would continue to speed up underwater even. So they did some testing in the swimming pool for like a counter diver weapon, self-defense weapon for divers.
Yeah.
Really cool stuff.
Seems to me cool, awesome concept, but this under like a M16, like where the grenade launcher is, or having the capability of using these gyrojet type shells in the grenade launcher would be freaking spot on.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they developed some larger. They also manufactured a lot of flares, you know, which is probably not surprising, but they had flare launchers. So I don't know if they had like a larger direct fire, like a 37 millimeter. I could pull it out of the book probably, but they tried every which way you can imagine. So some really, really cool one-off prototypes came out of that shop, but they're impossible to find. I'm not sure where they are. There's just one or two photos of them and a short description at this point, but they tried all kinds of stuff and had some very interesting potential there. But, you know, unfortunately it never caught on. CIA tested it very, very famously. At least one of those made it to Vietnam. I said earlier in this episode that I don't really talk about MACV SOG kind of stuff too much.
Yeah.
But one of these was in the hands of a one or maybe even two of the MACV SOG guys during the war. He just had it shipped over by his father. He just wanted a personal weapon. So he had it shipped over, and it might have been used. His name was George Sisler. And you probably have a lot of listeners who already know that name and probably know the story even. But he was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for his final battle. And it's believed he was carrying the gyrojet pistol when he died, and it's believed that he used it along with every other weapon that he was carrying in the fight that cost him his life.
Wow.
So one of these might have killed an NVA guy or a VC guy in Vietnam, but nobody is certain. That's
crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, because it makes like a whooshing
CIA
sound. It's a very distinctive sound when it's fired.
The CIA had one developed to deliver a biochem payload too, didn't they?
Yeah. I just posted about that on Instagram a few days ago, and it's in the book as well. And that was also developed by the same guys that did the gyrojet. It's been called the CIA heart attack gun. Is that the one you're talking about, you think? Yeah.
Yeah, the one they paraded out at the congressional hearings.
Yeah, exactly. At the church committee hearings in 75, It was on display. So that's on my Instagram right now if you want to take a look. I've got a little video from the hearings themselves. But it was developed by this company, MB Associates, which created the gyrojets. And initially, that's in the book. It's one of the biggest chapters in the book, as a matter of fact. Initially, this weapon was intended by them as a veterinary tranquilizer gun, because they wanted to be able to put down large animals, just put them to sleep for tests and that kind of thing. And they didn't want a loud firing weapon because they didn't want to spook, an elephant or a rhinoceros or, whatever have you.
Right.
Have it running away while the tranquilizer's, having its effect. So something like that, quiet firing, a dart, something like that, that's obviously very advantageous for some covert operations. So they offered it up to the CIA and to the Army's biological weapons lab, the Special Operations Division of the Army's biological weapons lab, and they tested it with some of their poisons, as well as tranquilizers, I believe, and it saw some limited testing, and apparently it was sent to Vietnam, but there's not really any reporting on it being used over there. I've heard some kind of anecdotal stuff that it was cool, but it didn't end up getting used because they already had a wide variety of suppressed weapons, like the Hush Puppy that you mentioned earlier. That was a more conventional weapon with a faster follow-up, shots, more accurate, that kind of thing. But this dart gun, the quote-unquote CIA heart attack gun, probably made its way to Vietnam in very, very limited numbers for use by Army Special Forces. But I haven't found anything real conclusive about that. There's one memorandum that's been declassified by the CIA that says that some of the people involved in the program, they thought that the Army Biolab probably sent it over to Vietnam for testing, but they weren't entirely sure. And that's pretty much all of the official documentation on that right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it wound up I don't know why in the world they brought it to the congressional hearings. I'm not sure what the intent was there. I mean, why would you show off something that is intended to, kill undetectably? Like, why would you do that? But you're kind of defeating the whole purpose. I mean, and these church hearings, they were kind of a watershed event because they ended any kind of opportunities for assassination programs. Like, prior to 1975, CIA was constantly trying to get Fidel Castro. I think most people listening to this know that. And they had to put a stop to their assassination programs because of all the heat that they were getting from up high on these failed assassinations. And then President Nixon, he also outlawed the use of biological and chemical weapons, so they couldn't use any of their poison stockpile, which they'd been developing either. So, most people will hear that and they say, yeah, that's just what they want you to think. But with that congressional heat, they had to lay off and they canceled these programs. Apparently, they didn't put this heart attack gun into use anymore, apparently. But that was kind of the end of all that. And I have yet to find anything to the contrary about that, although I don't think I will be able to convince people that they weren't, using poison guns on people later on after that.
Allegedly is a word we use a lot on the show.
Yeah, exactly. I tend to use allegedly, and I tend to write the word ostensibly a lot more than most people use it because, well, this is what they said was going on.
Right. You got to wonder if there was someone on the panel or the committee who knew about that gun, you know what I mean, because of some kind of contractual stuff or district-related things and had it trotted out as part of saying why we shouldn't do this stuff or something.
Yeah. I should look into that. I haven't watched the hearings in their entirety. There is a transcript of it, like 150, 200 pages, something like that. I haven't read them in full. There are some incredible anecdotes in there. They got very specific. They were talking about, yes, we had this guy that we found in Cuba. We got him a sniper rifle. We got him a silenced 1903 Springfield. He was supposed to take out Castro, but then he got cold feet, et cetera, et cetera. They revealed a lot of very damning stuff during those church committee hearings, and you can read through. There's a lot of interesting stories there for sure.
No doubt.
I have to just to go off on a tangent for 1 second, since we're talking about allegedly and ostensibly. I don't consider myself the world's best historian. I'm more of a pop historian, if anything. That might be a term that I just made up, but I just try to share. I try to share entertaining true stories, and I research them to the best of my ability. Well, I picked the worst possible niche to try to get to the bottom of anything.
Oh yeah,
because I find, I go through the old declassified documents, everything that's pulled up in, Wilson Center archives, I can get to the bottom of it. I've got a New York Times subscription just specifically so I can go back to stuff they were writing in 1953, for example, pull it right up. And I never know for certain if I've got the whole story, even if it's something that's supposedly been declassified completely and multiple people have written books about it. I never know if I've got the whole story. And then people will criticize and say, well, that's just what they want you to think about what really happened. So there's always a little bit of an element of doubt for me as to whether I got to the bottom of it or not. But, I do my best with every single story.
Yeah. Well, that's the, that probably would be one of the most frustrating parts about it to me would be doing all the research that, a lot of people that poke holes in your story haven't, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, dude, I have hours and hours and hours or weeks into this write-up and, someone's taking pot shots from the internet.
Oh, I know it. Yeah. In fact, I don't want to rant about my followers too much, but just the other day when I posted this story, I was working on it for quite a long time to pull up all the stuff on this heart attack gun that I could. And people in the comments are saying that's how they kill all the conservatives these days, like Andrew Breitbart. They're like, yeah, they got Breitbart with that. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Oh boy.
Maybe they did. I don't know. I don't think they did. So there's always something.
Yeah, it's always got to be politics. Everybody got their politics.
I know it.
All right, let's switch.
I'm going to look foolish if they did get Breitbart with that, though, honestly.
That's all right.
Like, wow, they really called it.
Well, that's the funny part, right? It's like you said, some of it's hard to prove, right? All you can do is share what you think you learned. But it's also probably really hard to prove it otherwise, right? I mean,
yeah.
There's only so much information there, and you tell the story, and I don't know. I think they're fascinating to read, and you never put it past people to come up with their own theories.
No. Well, I do my best to dig in as far as humanly possible with everything that I publish, but there's an element of doubt because you're dealing with people who are professional liars, like trained, professional, experienced liars, and they have whole funded departments specifically for putting out disinformation.
Right.
So
right.
It is a very tough field, is a tough slog to really feel totally confident in every single thing. But all I can do is look it up in 4 or 5 different places and see how well they match up,
Yeah. There's some really wild stuff in the book. Let's talk about some of the weirder things that are in here.
Sure.
The rat bomb was one that got my attention. I think you talked about that recently too in your feed or something, didn't you? Or maybe I saw it on...
Not too recently.
Maybe I saw it...
It gets around.
Yeah, maybe I saw it in the SOE 4045 feed recently.
Yeah, I think you did. As a matter of fact, that sounds exactly right. That's a fun one. That's so creative.
Why don't you explain to people what that is for folks that haven't seen it?
Sure. It's a very simple idea, very brilliant idea, honestly. And the SOE, that's the Special Operations Executive, they were tasked with sabotage. Of course, they wanted to end German war industry any way that they could. They wanted to sow doubt. They wanted to put a stop to any kind of assembly line stuff, destroy critical infrastructure,
right?
All of that. So one of the very, very clever ideas that they came up with was to put an explosive device inside the carcass of a dead rat, an actual dead rat, not a stuffed toy or something like that. So they simply bought a whole bunch of rats from a laboratory, I think it was, and 100 of them, and they would kill them. They would strip out most of the, the guts and everything, the interior, and they would stuff it full of plastic explosives. And after that, you can't get a whole lot in a rat. You're talking about 8 ounces, maybe 10 ounces, something like that. Not a giant. You're not going to destroy a building with this by any means, but it was enough. The idea was that they would smuggle these into occupied areas, whether France, Germany, wherever have you, and the dead rat could be dropped off in factories, in a corner, in a basement, something like that. And they thought that what would probably happen was that the maintenance people, the janitors, when they're cleaning up and they find a dead rat, nothing surprising about that, they would take that carcass and they would throw it into the boiler, the steam boiler, which was, in the basement of a lot of these buildings, the powering, heating it, and all that. And that boiler would set off the pencil fuse, which was inside. And I hate to say it, but, they inserted this pencil fuse up the rear of the rat. So just the tip of it is sticking out of the back of the rat. And, heat activated once it falls into the boiler, and that would be enough to destroy this high pressure boiler to begin with. And that would take this factory off of line for 6 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, maybe a week, while they replace the boiler. So they had some really bad luck. Unfortunately, it's a great idea, but their luck ran out on the very first shipment. They sent 100 of these to France, and they were found during a cargo inspection because the Germans were very, very on top of their counter-espionage and counter-intelligence game at that time. So the very first shipment got discovered, and they realized that they were dealing with rat bombs. And in a way, the silver lining to that was that it scared them so bad that they were deathly afraid of any rat carcasses that they found all over. Word got out quickly that any rat carcass might be an improvised explosive device at that point. They kept a few of the rats. Some of them wound up in training academies. They would put it on display. So I've got a couple of pictures of it now. They're very rotten and disgusting looking now because they're 75 years old or something like that. But the Germans kept a few. They had very grudging respect for this idea. And it's not known if any of the subsequent deliveries were ever put into boilers or anything like that. But once the idea got out, it created a whole lot of doubt and suspicion and concern about what might or might not be an explosive device. So it's just a really cool historical footnote, I think. A really clever, easily implemented idea, and it's kind of the last thing that they would suspect until they actually stumble onto it.
Right. Yeah, you got to imagine inspecting a shipment. It's why are there 100 dead rats in this container? Yeah,
exactly. And they're they're stuffed underneath wine bottles or whatever was actually in the box. They're clearly hiding these for a reason.
Right.
So what is it? So they probably figured that out pretty quick once they actually unboxed it. But it was a great idea. I have to give them a lot of credit for that idea.
Hey, high five to that idea, even for the PSYOP angle of it, right? Like you said, getting the idea in the heads of the Germans, that's probably worth whatever it took to do it in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, because every time, if you think that every actual rat carcass, of which there would be thousands all over the place back then, is a bomb, then you've got to, all right, clear the area, let's get a explosives guy in here, or let's very carefully carry it outside, or I'm not working in the basement anymore, there's too many dead rats. There's just a lot of potential scenarios there.
Oh, yeah. We had a knife maker on a little while ago, a friend of ours who was an EOD guy in the Marines. I'm not. We'll have to ask him if he ever had to deal with a rat bomb. I'm going to guess no.
Right.
That would have been his life, cleaning out rats that were turning out not to be bombs.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I've seen video of a donkey bomb. I do recall a donkey bomb.
Oh, really?
Point, on the side of the road, yeah. But you can get a lot more explosives in a donkey than you can a rat. So
Oh, yeah.
that makes sense. That idea carries weight.
Yeah, donkey bomb would be an exciting situation.
That would be a great shirt.
Donkey bomb.
You can create a lot more explosives in
man.
a donkey than a rat.
Yeah, you can.
That's what. Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's marketable.
Donkey bomb is the name of Sean and I's new band. I like that. Donkey bomb.
Yeah.
All right. Any other weirdo ones in your book that you want to mention? There's a few of them, and there's cigarette gun. I mean, there's all kinds of goofy stuff in there.
Yeah, that was that one to me. I suspect that one didn't really work. It is a pretty interesting idea. The only one that I have found so far is in the private collection of Keith Melton, who is a very well-known, very wealthy collector of these clandestine and covert devices. He wrote the book Spycraft, which I didn't take the name from my account from his book, but it has been a good resource. I actually found out about the book after I, created the name. But he's written a book, and he's a very wealthy collector, like a Navy veteran who spent many years collecting every kind of device that he could. So he's got one of these cigarette pistols, and it's another thing, a little bit like that hold-up gun that we talked about. It's an interesting idea, and it has some limited potential, but it probably won't really work. So that was just an actual cigarette, like wasn't even a metal tube, I don't think, with a 22 short round in it, a very, very low-powered round that would fit in a cigarette, and I think it had like a pull cord on it that you could pop out one end of the filter, and that's actually a little a string, like what do you call a lanyard on the inside, so you can yank that and fire the cigarette forward from it. But I'm not sure how realistic that was. A 22 short, of course it can't be reloaded or anything like that. I guess you got to fumble out another cigarette if you need a follow-up shot or anything. So a cool idea, maybe if you shoot it right into somebody's eyeball, if you're leaning forward to give them a smoke and you shoot them right in the face or something, it might work. But other than that, pretty limited usefulness. But it did show up actually in a version of it showed up in one of the Bond films later on, where he carries a cigarette and he has somebody light it, and it's actually got like a rocket inside of it. He fires it at an engineer, a Japanese engineer, I think. So it worked out a lot better in the movie than it probably would have in real life. But I guess that's true of a lot of things.
Isn't that a gyrojet?
That's one of the rockets. So the cigarette the cigarette gun idea came before, but then they inserted one of the gyrojet mini rockets, not the 13 millimeter from the pistol, but like a mini rocket, like a 3 millimeter, I think it was, something like that they fired. And it was just a pyrotechnic, like a film pyrotechnic, of course, but it was based on the gyrojet design, one of the many gyrojet designs.
Wow.
It seems like for clandestine type guns, like a zip gun pin type thing seems like that would work about as good as anything. You could throw a 9 millimeter in there or a 38 or whatever, and it would still be a nice size, and looks like a pin. They're easy to make, I would assume.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the concept of those. I don't own one myself. I haven't shot one. I follow Billy Trident. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him.
Yeah.
On Instagram, he's always shooting off pen guns. I don't know if he has just one that he's always shooting, or if he's got a collection of several. But he does them quite a bit. He'll shoot a milk jug, and some of them have like a little bit of a bird shot in them, or some of them are a larger caliber round. But I think there's a lot of real world use for those. Certainly, a very successful design, and they're very prolific as well. They've been around for about 100 years now because they're so simple to manufacture.
Yeah, the cigarette gun, that even a 22 short in your hand would be pretty exciting going off. That would have to be a last ditch.
Yeah, I would not want to use that in my dominant hand the first time around, for sure. If I have to lose a finger, I'd rather it be on the non-dominant hand,
Right.
So I just pulled up Billy Trident and on Instagram, and I'm checking him out. He's got some G10 keys that are really cool, and I thought this might be a cool segue into some of the stuff that you're doing, your sponsors with G10.
Oh, yeah, you mean Black Triangle?
Yeah.
Black Triangle, I've been working with them for a while. I have one of their blades right now, and people who've listened to my podcast have probably heard me talk about it, but I've got their Donovan blade, which he named after Wild Bill Donovan from the commander of the OSS during World War II, and it's super cool. It's one of my favorite pieces. Certainly, it's G10, so it's very what's the word I would use? I wouldn't say non-detectable, but less detectable, I guess. So I've had it for like a year now, and I use it a lot. Honestly, it's super cool, and it came with so many cool extras. He's got a VHS tape case that he sends it to you in. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's like when you get it in the mail, it's like an 80s action film VHS case, and you pop it open, and you've got your G10 knife in there, and a couple of other things he send you. Is really, really cool stuff. So I'm a big fan of that. And he's another guy, he kind of reminds me of myself. He's just, a very, very small operation, something he's put together on his own. He's not like a big corporation or anything like that. So I'm a big fan of his, honestly.
Yeah, we looked at some of the stuff and very stabby and based off my experience, I find G10 especially to be a really good, not necessarily like to sneak on an airplane or anything, because we don't use metal detectors anymore. We use density scanners. Mm-hmm. So that won't work. But as a concealable self-defense knife, they actually make really good sense because, they won't rust. They're actually much lighter than a similar steel knife.
Oh, yeah.
And, for at least in my experience, when I've sharpened them, to with a 110 grit or 120 grit sandpaper somewhere in there, they're actually pretty toothy, and they will make a pretty bad cut, and they're plenty strong for being stabby. So kind of cool material, cool concept.
Yeah, that was my first one of G10, and I was not exactly sure what to expect, but it's a lot more solid and hefty than I had anticipated, honestly. Like, it feels very, very strong, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the cool part about them. They're very strong, but the weight compared to a steel blade of the same size is tiny, right?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Super lightweight, easy to stash, comfortable to have on your person.
Makes a great running knife when you're going to be sweating or anything like that, saltwater type stuff. It's not something you want to open packages with. That's not their purpose. High wear resistance isn't their forte,
right.
But when it comes to stabbing stuff, they do a pretty damn good job, and they're usually less expensive than the steel version too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In fact, I think A.G. Russell kind of did a similar knife out of like a FRN, the CIA dagger, and I think we've talked about that in the past too. That was kind of interesting.
Yep. What was the one you liked out of this Black Triangle lineup, Sean? There was one that caught your eye.
Dude, I'm trying to find it, and I can't find my old search result for it.
Oh, the Midnight Creeper.
That's it.
Yeah. You just like that because of the name.
Well, it don't hurt.
That is a great name.
The Midnight Creeper, right? With almost like a, like a mushroom shape on the butt end of it. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's got a little skull cracker there.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. What else do we want to talk about, Justin? I know what it was. You had mentioned to me some points that you wanted to make about the difference between Eastern and Western design stuff, and some stuff that you noticed. That sounds really interesting.
I don't know if I would describe it as points I want to make, but one of the things that draws me back to the weapons really, and one of the reasons that I divided the book up by countries, by organizations, is because you can see when you've got them all grouped together like that, you can see there's like a very different mindset that went into these, even though, of course, they were mostly designed by separate individuals. It's not Kalashnikov versus Browning exactly, where they're creating all the same stuff. But I was really amazed at the ideas, the driving forces behind a lot of this. And one of the cool things is that, like we said earlier, these captive piston rounds, the Russians, like pretty early on, they went with silent ammunition rather than silenced firearms or suppressed firearms. And I mean, not exclusively, of course, they have suppressed weapons. Certainly they've got some more conventional weapons, but they invested in a big way into this unique ammunition in a way that the West really has not done hardly at all. One of the only examples that I found, and it's also in the book, of captive piston ammunition in the U.S. is a revolver that probably a few guys are familiar with. It's the Quiet Special Purpose revolver from Vietnam era. It was developed for the tunnel rats. A lot of people know the tunnel rats from Vietnam. Some of the most insanely brave guys that have ever lived or worked or deployed, certainly. But these guys, they were carrying a modified Smith & Wesson revolver cut way down, and it was firing captive piston ammunition. And this was just about one of the only examples, because, you know, you're in an enclosed tunnel, super compact space, so they had a very short barrel. Adding a suppressor to a weapon, you know, just increases the length and makes it more difficult to use when you're, you know, in a shoulder width tunnel.
Yeah.
And firing an unsuppressed weapon is you know, you're going to be deaf, no question about it, you know, in those compact spaces. So they developed this captive piston ammunition, and it was loaded with shot. As a matter of fact, it wasn't just so it was pellets. It was a 10 it had 10, I think 10 pellets inside. So because you're oftentimes in pitch dark, or you just got a flashlight and that's it. So it was called the special purpose revolver, and that's certainly what it was. And that's an amazing weapon, but it's also just about the only one developed in the West that uses captive piston ammunition, whereas the Russians used it in multiple designs over a couple of generations.
Yeah. You got to wonder, did they get the idea for the captive piston stuff from Russian captures or whatever?
Yeah, I have to wonder. I didn't find necessarily the origin. I mean, it's a known concept, you know, it just wasn't one that really caught on. The ammunition is expensive to manufacture. You know, it didn't fit with anything else. It was an unusual caliber. It was a revolver caliber. So it just didn't catch on for whatever reason. I guess they were using, you know, external suppressors, you know, on so many other weapons of that era that's what they stuck with. And, you know, Americans went with the suppressed 22 high standard in World War II, and that served for, you know, 50 years in a lot of circumstances, and suppressed 9mm, of course, even though those are supersonic. But the Russians had multiple weapons with this captive ammunition, which makes for a very, very compact weapon, low recoil, super quiet, and you know, it doesn't eject. They don't eject the rounds, so they're maintaining the rounds, which has its own disadvantages. But you know, you can see they are really going for leave no trace. Really is the best way how to put it. And I think that's an interesting dichotomy there between the East versus West, and how they approach these weapons that were, you know, going to be used for covert operations.
Yeah, right. Very, very heavy emphasis on "I was never here" part of the situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I hate to say it, but the book kind of bears that out, because I have almost no real world examples of the Russian and Soviet usage of these weapons. Like, they exist, they're out there. You can see videos of them being fired. They've been sold. They've been, you know, issued to different organizations, but almost nothing about when and how they were used and against whom. You know, somebody out there has been killed by one of these things.
Right.
You know what I mean? But we have just almost no stories about it, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's working exactly by intent, right?
That's working right well.
Right, exactly. So,
yeah.
I mean, I guess we can see who really had the better idea in that sense, if the stories are still not leaking out, you know, in the ensuing decades.
Maybe so. All right. Well, we talked about at the end of the show, or toward the end, having you go through a story or two that you like from your book. Like you said, you know, we're into the knife gun piece of it. We love that stuff, right? Because we're gadget dorks. But as you mentioned a couple times, and I think you dug into it a little bit in some of the earlier ones you told us about, the people aspect of this is really, really fascinating. And just the idea, as you said, of someone who's willing to basically give it all for a country maybe they've never been in, or a cause that they've never, you know what I mean, that they don't have a direct connection to, and somehow end up so sold on an idea, right, that they're all in. That's just a wild concept to think about.
It really is. So the guy that comes immediately to mind is also one of the best known, and so people that have been following this for a while will know him. It's a guy named Adolf Tolkachev, who was a Soviet engineer, and he approached the CIA in Moscow in the late 1970s. I think you started around 1977, if I recall correctly.
Okay.
So he basically he was a Russian citizen, a Soviet citizen, working engineer in some very, very high level aviation stuff. He was working on like Russian stealth. He was working on some of their missile programs, you know, some very, very important stuff that we really wanted to know about. And he hated the Soviet government because most of his wife's family, or much of his wife's family, were killed by Stalin or they were sent off to the gulags, 20 years, 30 years previously.
Yeah.
So he had this deep hatred for not so much communism, but specifically for the Soviet government, I think. So he eventually cowboyed up, I guess, to use an American aphorism, and he decided he was going to be proactive about it. So he approached, his method was basically to go near the U.S. Embassy. He went to a gas station near the U.S. Embassy. He would walk by it frequently and look for an American car with an American person there, because he knew that they were under surveillance. He was under surveillance. Everybody's under surveillance in Moscow in the 70s. And so he found somebody there, and he dropped a note through their window of their car. And the note basically said, I have information. I want to meet with somebody. Here is how you can contact me. Very briefly, just walked by the car, dropped it in there, and walked away. Well, as luck would have it, the person whose car he dropped it into was the CIA chief of station for Moscow, and not planned at all. So this note falls in his car. He retrieves it. He reads it. And he thinks, and everybody else thinks, that this is probably a dangle, which is the Soviets basically trying to entrap them with something that's too good to be true.
Right.
So they ignore it. And Tolkachev, this guy, just the stones on this guy, I can't believe it. Nobody approaches him. He waits, and he goes back again. He does it again. And I think he ends up doing it like 2 more times. He keeps approaching Americans, and he keeps putting his life at risk because he really wants to get in contact, and he really wants to do his part to end the Soviet government. So finally, they start taking him seriously because he provides a little bit more specific information, because he knows that they don't trust him yet because they don't know him.
Right.
So eventually they're like, this guy's the real deal. There's no way they would give up what's in this note just to try to entrap one of us and, kick us out of country or something like that. So they end up meeting with him. The first meeting is beyond their wildest expectations. They take a bunch of precautions, of course, and he passes over a lot of handwritten notes. I don't think he passed any film or anything the first time, but they realize this is the guy they've been dreaming of within, Soviet military technological development. So he ends up working for the CIA from 1979 until 1985. I think he only meets with them like maybe 26 times in that whole time period. And, each meeting is just completely fraught with danger because of the level of surveillance and everything that we already talked about earlier in the episode, but keeps meeting with them. He's turning over microfilm. He's turning over like hundreds of pages of handwritten notes. And he's also writing on these honestly beautiful letters. He's kind of explaining his motivations for what he does. He's a very eloquent guy. He's very articulate, and he writes about how he's fallen in love with a country that he's never seen before.
Oh, wow.
But he wants them to win. And it's kind of heartbreaking, honestly. So in the end, this guy, after everything he gives, they call him the $1 billion spy. That's the title of the book that is written about him.
Yeah.
They call him the $1 billion spy because he saved the U.S. over $1 billion in research and development because of, and it was probably much more, it was probably 10 or 20 or $30 billion, honestly, because of how much insight he was able to give into Soviet advancements. And, in some ways they were ahead of us. In some ways they were developing stuff that we didn't have. So he was very, very valuable guy. Well, in the end, he was betrayed. He was betrayed by Aldrich James in the CIA, who's, one of the worst traitors in American history. Ames gives up his name to a guy when he meets him in Washington, D.C. He gives it up for cash because he just wants to live a more extravagant lifestyle. And it's not cutting in on a CIA salary. So the Soviets begin an investigation into Tolkachev. They had already gotten close to him because they knew that they had a leak, but they didn't know who. And he had earlier, like in 1983 or so, he had demanded a suicide pill from the CIA because of how dangerous it was what he was doing.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to give it to him. And he said, okay, well, I'm not meeting with you anymore until I get a pill. So they backtracked. They brought him a pill. And at one point in, I think, 83, he was so scared about being caught that every time he was called into his boss's office in the research facility, he would put that pill in his mouth and prepare to bite down on it if somebody was waiting in the office behind the door.
Oh,
because
wow.
the KGB guys, they would just be standing behind the door when you open it and they'd grab you. So he was ready to kill himself in an instant. And he did that several times apparently until the danger kind of passed. So he makes it through that situation. They don't ever zero in on him until 2 years later when Ames finally gives up his name specifically, along with a bunch of other guys who were all killed as well. So Tolkachev, they figure out it's him, of course. He goes out of town, I think, to visit his mother-in-law or something. I don't recall exactly. While he's out of town, they search his apartment, and they find the suicide pill because he had gotten a little bit complacent and he left it home this time when instead of taking it with him, because, you know, it had been a couple of years at this point and nothing had happened.
Yeah.
So they find the pill. They know that he's the guy. They know he's willing to kill himself. So they set up a fake roadblock one day and they film it. So you can see this footage on my account or, you know, on YouTube or wherever you want, the Tokachev arrest footage. But traffic cop pulls him out of his car, tells him to walk up here. They got to check his license or something like that. And four KGB guys swarm him and they grab him and they hustle him into a van. And if you look closely at the footage, you can see that they're choking him and they're basically putting their fingers in his mouth at the same time to prevent him from swallowing anything. So they're like, you know, strangling him and preventing him from taking, because they didn't know if he had more than one suicide pill. So they hustle him into the van. They get him out of there. He winds up being, you know, interrogated and brutalized for like a year until he's finally put on trial. He's given a one-day trial, found guilty, and he's executed, I think, that night.
Wow.
Basically. And, you know, it's a show trial, but he was guilty. He did do everything they accused him of, of course. So he never did see America. He fell in love with the country and never got to visit it in the end. But he's very well known now, and he was one of the best American assets during the Cold War, certainly, if not the best.
Yeah.
But a terribly tragic story, and he was undone by an American traitor, you know, of all things.
Right. Wow.
So that's a big story. I've done a podcast episode on that, and there's a movie in the works right now.
Oh, really?
About him. It's going to be called The $1 Billion Spy. There's a famous actor that's going to play him. Let me look up who that is really quick. His name is escaping me at the moment. Yeah, Mads Mikkelsen. Okay. If you guys are familiar with him.
Wow.
He is cast right now to play Tokachev in a film. So I certainly hope that is eventually made. I think it's kind of in development at the moment.
Yeah.
But that'll be good.
Like you said, it's a great story, right? I mean, it's tragic. But it's that I can see how that would make a great movie, right? To kind of go through how he got to the mental state where he was willing to do it and kind of then all the craziness that unfolds afterward.
And, you know, it was all predicated on what happened years and years before to people he wasn't even related to at that time. But this, you know, Stalin and his successors like Beria, you know, those guys were horribly brutal, in particular Stalin. But the early days of the Soviet Union were horribly, horribly brutal. Millions and millions of people were killed, sent off to the gulags, all that. And it had ramifications for many, many years to come, because how could you live in a system like that? How could you support a system like that when you knew that there were other options out there? And so a lot of the best sources that the American intelligence ever had and British intelligence ever had were volunteers. And they were guys like Tokachev who hated the Soviet system, basically. And, you know, we've had a few people who were true believers in communism, more than a few, really. We've had some true believers in communism. And, you know, in most cases, they had quite a wake-up call once they actually made it to the other side of the Iron Curtain and had to live with communism.
Yeah.
So a lot of regret there, but at that point, it's too late, you know.
Exactly. Well, fascinating stuff. Justin, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, Mark. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Tom, Sean,
awesome.
It's been great.
Super interesting. So like we said, definitely check out Justin's Instagram. We've talked about it many times, Spycraft 101. Both of your books, they can find links to where to buy the book at the website and get rich with their free Soviet ruble, right?
Yep. Don't spend it all in one place, guys. Okay? You only get one.
So you can get that if you buy it direct from Justin. I think you had a deal, right? Where if you buy both books, you got a little bit of a break or something. It seems like
yeah. There's like $4 or $5 off the price, you know, and it's mainly because I can ship them in one package, so it saves me shipping costs as well. To be honest,
yeah, the books are super interesting. Our listeners are big book people, so definitely check out the books. They're well put together and well researched. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, I didn't notice it, and maybe you did this after you did the podcast episode on it, but you have a second Instagram account now, right?
Yeah, I sure. I just started it like a month ago.
Okay.
I think. That one is called Cold War Stamps. It's cold.war.stamps. And the reason I started that is I went down a little rabbit hole, which is an unfortunate vice of mine, really. And I ended up doing a podcast episode on this recently, but I was shocked to find out how much very, very interesting espionage and covert operations kind of history is portrayed on postage stamps all over the world. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because postage stamps are one of the most prolific types of government-sponsored art. that's out there. Most of ours, you get them now. Mostly you're going to get the American flag, but you can get a lot of stuff from the post office right now. But since the beginning of postage stamps, they've always been a way to showcase art or something that the current government is proud of, that kind of thing. And because of that, a lot of people in the intelligence world have been portrayed on these mostly in other countries, not so much in the United States, but in other countries. So I did an episode recently with a guy named Dr. Mark Pruitt, who's written a book about Russian postage stamps and how the story that they are trying to tell with these heroes of the intelligence community that they put on there. These guys are actually a bunch of murderers and torturers, and the founder of the Gulag system was portrayed on a stamp in 2002. Right. Just an example. Like these are a bunch of psychopaths basically, but you would never know it from the very generous and forgiving portrait that they have on a stamp and the backstory that's available on the official Russian government websites right now. So really digging into history and finding out it's nothing like they want you to think it is right now has really opened some doors for me. So that account is still pretty small. I haven't done a ton of posting to it yet, but I have a lot coming there. As just an example, this Cuban government, beginning in 1962, the year after it happened, they started putting out a lot of stamps commemorating their victory at the Bay of Pigs. And of course, Bay of Pigs for us is a serious defeat because we tried to overthrow Fidel Castro's government using a bunch of Cuban expat volunteer fighters. Yeah. And it failed. It failed completely. And ever since then, the Cuban government has commemorated their victory there many, many times. So they've got, pictures of brave soldiers holding a battle-scarred Cuban flag. They've got pictures of, an American plane crashing into the ocean. And they've got pictures of the Barbara J, which was the ship, the freighter that they use. That's on fire in one of their stamps. It's like it was staffed by CIA and Cuban guys. So just some fascinating stuff out there. And so I'm kind of digging into that now when I have time.
Yeah. The episode was really good, and it's kind of funny because when I saw the episode and started listening to it, I'm like, I'm listening to an episode about stamps. What am I doing? But it was fascinating. Like you said, that the story that's behind these things is really, really interesting, right? And on different topics, and I don't know, it's just kind of a gateway to more stories, it feels like.
Yeah, I was not a stamp collector before this, but I guess I'm fully embracing my middle-age vices now or something. I don't know. I'm becoming progressively more boring as time goes by, but I'm getting into that now in a big way. And my wife's already tired of it because they're spread all over the coffee table upstairs. I'm like, I'm going to get them organized. Don't worry.
Right. Yeah. So for people that are listening and saying, oh my God, these guys are talking about stamps now, go listen to Justin's episode about it. It tells a very, very interesting story about some of this kind of stuff. So. Well, very cool. Yeah, definitely check out Justin's podcast too, Spycraft 101 podcast. We're fans. It's a great show. Very interesting guests. Like I said, if you're like me, you'll listen to some of these things and like, how on earth did Justin get this guy? Because the stories are awesome. There was a really good one about university recruitment sort of stuff, like that people through the education system recruiting, I guess, candidates for, covert things or espionage. I thought that was really fascinating too. So
that's a great place to find a true believer who doesn't have enough life experience to add that perspective and realize what they're getting into, unfortunately. Yeah. We kind of explored that in that episode.
Absolutely. I thought that was really cool. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, again, thanks for joining us, Justin. We appreciate it. And high five to all of our Patreon supporters and our friends that join us in our Facebook group. We have a great Facebook group where listeners come and chat with us about cool stuff that we talk about on the show. So be interested to hear from people there. I'm sure some of them have maybe their own stories to tell about stuff. We see that a lot with knives. We'll talk about some interesting knife history, and out of nowhere, a listener shows up in our Facebook group and we see a knife or maybe even a name that we haven't heard of in a long time, or a really interesting piece. So we'll look forward to the feedback on this one.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a real pleasure. Tom, Sean, great talking to you guys as well.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Pleasure was ours.
Keep kicking ass and telling stories.
I have a lot more to share. Certainly, I've shared some big ones, and I still have a few big ones in my back pocket.
Well, we'll have to figure out a way to have you back with us sometime in the future. We'll watch for your future book release stuff. I got a feeling you got more of this coming.
I'm working on book number 3 right now. I'm hoping it will be done by Christmas, but I've hoped for a lot of deadlines that I've not met. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's how deadlines work, it seems like.
Yes, unfortunately. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, folks.
All right. Thank you, guys. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.